What's up, guys? This is Phil Galfond for RunAt.once.com, and I'd like to welcome you to Thinking Out Loud, Episode 2, Expected Value. This is actually going to be Episode 2A, or Episode 2, Part 1, if you will. I had two separate ideas for some concept videos, and they kind of merged together, but not so tightly that I can include them in one video, but they do deserve to be together. So today we're going to dive into Part 1, in which I'm going to cover initiative, the multi-street bluff, and something I like to call the 50% myth. Starting with an overview here. You're supposed to start with an overview, but we're going to get to these points anyways, so let's not waste too much time with it. Power of initiative, continuation bets, barreling, 50% myth, floating. Now you guys know what's coming. So we're going to talk about the power of initiative. I have power in quotes because, if any of you have seen a number of my videos, you might have heard me say that I think initiative is overrated, and the reason you'll have heard it is because I believe it to be true. And today we're going to talk a little bit about why. Specifically why people love initiative so much. So some standard complaints that you'll hear about playing without the initiative. Hands are easier to play with the initiative, and the player with impetus wins the pot more often. Furthermore, some justifications that I hear all the time for various plays that have to do with initiative are, I'll bet here to set up a profitable river bluff. He folds enough to my c-bets in 3-bet pots that they're almost immediately profitable, so I can 3-bet a lot more of my bluffs. And I can't count the number of times I've heard something justified based on building a pot that I'll win over half the time. I'm sure all of you have heard many of these things said, or maybe said them yourself. And in and of themselves, they are not good justifications. They're not logically sound justifications for making plays. So moving on with some initiative and psychology, playing without the initiative feels worse. There's no doubt about it, and there are several reasons as to why it feels worse to play without the initiative. First of all, as humans, we've evolved to fear things that cause us pain. If you are a caveman and you happen upon your first fire and you, out of curiosity, put your face in that fire, it's going to hurt quite a bit. And the next time you happen upon a fire, if you're lucky enough to have survived the first time, you are going to be afraid to put your face near it. Hopefully. Or you will not live to procreate. So, in poker and in life, the brain's rewarded for wins and punished for losses. And it's a way that, we as humans were able to survive. But unfortunately, it doesn't work out very well in poker because logically you need to separate yourself from certain plays that cause pain. So a perfect example is if you're playing a limit game and you're consistently seeing river bets and getting 7-1 and calling and losing most of the time like you were supposed to. It's not pleasant to do that, and your brain doesn't like it. And so a lot of people will end up not calling as much as they should because it feels like their body is telling them not to, or their brain is telling them not to. And without the initiative, you are losing more pots, meaning you're punished more often. People don't like to be the one who's guessing. I put guessing in quotes because really we're all guessing, no matter if we're the ones deciding to call down with a bluff catcher, or we're the ones deciding to value bet thinly, or bluff with, bluff and decide how much fold equity we have. But people don't like being the one guessing by calling down. They're the ones that have their hand more face up, and their opponent is the one who has a polarized range and gets to play very aggressively. But what's important to realize here is that initiative is not the reason that you're in a position to be the one guessing. The reason that you're in a position to be the one guessing is because your opponent has the more polarized range in these spots. And no matter how much you take the initiative, if you are forcing money into pots with bluff catchers more than need be, you're going to be losing more. So sure, you can get the initiative, and maybe you can make them guess a little bit. But being the one who's calling down is really a function of range versus range situation, at least from a theoretical perspective. People feel handcuffed with the bottom of their range when they don't have the initiative, because when you do have the initiative, the preflop raiser, for example, gets to make a lot of cheap poor to no equity bluffs. And when you're out of position, especially, and don't have the initiative, it becomes very difficult to win any pots with the bottom of your range. At least the absolute, early street bottom of your range. Obviously, you can get to the river in certain ways and win the pots then. People also feel that playing with the initiative leads to fewer mistakes. Once again, mistakes is in quotes. I'm using a lot of quotes here. Here's some more. People look at calling or folding incorrectly versus bluffing or semi-bluffing incorrectly in much different ways. So if you're calling down in a big pot and you happen to be wrong, it's a little bit painful, at least for most people. If you are the one bluffing or semi-bluffing, especially semi-bluffing, people never feel that they're making a bad play. When they do get caught, they think, oh, well, I had equity and I had fold equity and the play was fine. The same is true when they're bluffing. If they get called on the river, it usually doesn't bother people quite as much as being the one stressed throughout the hand and calling down. Another thing to think about is oftentimes when you don't have the initiative, you also don't have position. So when you're defending from the blinds, is it hard because you don't have initiative or because you're out of position? Or furthermore, is it hard because you have the weaker range? I suspect that of these three things, initiative is the least of your problems by far. Preflop playing, continuation betting. So, as I said, for all those reasons, people routinely overestimate the benefit of initiative. I do realize I'm just reading these slides, but they're written kind of well, so it's okay. So what happens when people overestimate the value of initiative? They put themselves in spots to have the initiative more often. They shy away from spots where they don't have initiative. So this leads to overfolding, and it leads to too high of an aggression factor in preflop situations especially. This is hard to prove mathematically, what I believe. When you start from preflop especially, the game is so large that you can't really, with any type of certainty at all, figure out the difference in EV between a 3-bet and a call with certain hands, or at least I don't know how to, and that's a cute little smiley. So I'll need to use some simplistic examples to hint at my points. So some bad logic. We have a situation here, and it's a extremely simplified situation, as most of these will be. And they're not used to they're not used as examples of common situations and common thought processes, but they are kind of extreme examples of them to illustrate my points. So let's look at the action first. It's 5, 10, 6 max PLO, 1K stacks. Cutoff raises to 2250 with 35% of his hands, and Bob's in the big blind with Jack 7, 7, 5 single suited. A pretty weak hand, but there are antes in the pot, and he's getting a really good price. So here's some things that he knows about the cutoff. The cutoff c-bets every time that Bob calls. Cutoff also calls 3-bets every time if Bob opts to 3-bet. But in those 3-bet pots, he's going to fold half the time to a continuation bet, and it doesn't even have to be a pot-size continuation bet. So what Bob says to me is, I have to fold the flop almost always when I defend, but if I 3-bet, he folds 50% of flops. It's immediately profitable. So let's look at it a little bit further. We'll start with calling. Our hot and cold equity with this hand against 35% range is 43% or just under, but only just under 22% of the time are we going to flop 55% equity or more. When we do, it'll be 70% on average. So in a pretty much worst case calling scenario, let's say 78% of the time we fold the flop, and we only continue when we have 55% equity or more against his c-betting range, which remember is 100% of his pre-flop opening range. 22% of the time, so yeah, 78% of the time we're going to lose our pre-flop call. 22% of the time we're going to call a $37.50 c-bet. So adding up the pot pre and the pot on the flop is $137. $137. I'm going to assume that with our 70% equity, we're going to realize 70% of that pot. We are at a position without the initiative. However, I actually think this is an underestimate. When you have 70% equity, oftentimes you're going to continue by raising. And if not, you still have a lot of implied odds against his wide range that you're a significant favorite against. So I think realizing 70% of the pot is a little bit conservative. Since we're looking at situations where we have 55% equity or more, With this specific hand, we've probably flopped mostly, two pair, trips, sets, and flushes. So once we realize 70% of the pot minus the 50 we put in, we're making $46. And when you multiply those by the probability at which they happen, you have a basically neutral preflop call. In reality, the EV of calling here is going to be higher with any kind of reasonable play. Obviously, we're up against an opponent, though, who's c-betting 100%, which is also not very reasonable. But I think there's something to take away from this, which I'll talk about here. It's not very hard to profit when getting 4-1 immediate odds. Not a big surprise, but a lot of people are afraid to play a weak hand in this spot. They don't like being put in tough situations, but as this illustrates, you don't even have to continue in many tough situations to make this preflop call profitable. Most importantly, folding 78% of flops with this hand is better than folding preflop. People get very caught up on their defending ranges, and there are certain situations in poker where, due to the nature of how you got into the situation, and this is a perfect example, your range is going to be a lot weaker than your opponent's range. And in those situations, you are not able to defend often enough to make his bluffs indifferent or his bluffs not profitable. So don't try to. It doesn't mean that you've made a mistake at any point in this hand. We choose to make a profitable call preflop with great odds as a better alternative. So making that call preflop and folding 78% of flops is still a better alternative than folding preflop. So now Bob wants to talk to me about 3-betting. We have those same numbers, although I didn't need to put them now. So 50% of the time after we 3-bet, we're going to c-bet and he's going to fold the flop. So we've put in 79.5 minus 10 because 10 was our big blind, and we're going to win 171 minus that 69.5 that we put in, which is going to equal $101.05. Pretty good, half the time. The other half the time, we're going to bet 125 into this pot of 171. So, like I said, not even a full pot c-bet, and he's already folding half the time. So now we add up the pot. We have 27% equity against his continuing range, which is top 50%. I said we're going to realize 20% of the pot, which I actually think is a tiny bit high. This is a hand that does not do very well, obviously, against a continuing range if we're betting every flop. We're not going to get to realize a lot of our equity. We'll have some weak flush draws that will give us reverse implied odds. Oftentimes, he'll have a pair plus flush draw, and a lot of our equity will come from our 7-7 being good at the moment and giving us 30% equity. But we're never going to be able to realize that because he's going to make us fold. So that, combined with the fact that he has position, I think 20% of the pot is a pretty reasonable assumption. And we're actually losing 110 in that case, which, as you can guess, makes us lose about $4.40 on average when we 3-bet preflop. Now, the numbers can be manipulated. You can consider yourself to have more equity in the pot or realize more of the pot when your opponent calls. However, keep in mind also our opponent is going to raise sometimes, so it's much more difficult to realize our equity in the pot when that happens. But an important point here, whether or not you think the assumptions make a lot of sense, is I know a lot of people who would say if your opponent's going to fold half the time to a 2/3 pot c-bet, then absolutely raise preflop with anything because you're going to be profiting immediately. And this shows a fairly reasonable situation where that's not true. So what do we learn? What I just said. The fact that he's going to fold half the flops to a less than pot size bet does not guarantee a profitable 3-bet preflop. And I think that's something that maybe many of you know, but many people get wrong. So I have some anecdotal evidence, not a massive sample, but I looked at my database and I filtered by hands in which I called preflop and went heads up to the flop out of position because I wanted to see how often I won the pot and how I was doing overall. So in these situations, I won the pot around 44% of the time. So, as we guessed, the player with initiative and position is going to win the pot more often. The average pot that I won was 25 big blinds, and the average pot that I lost was 20 big blinds. And If this seems strange to you, it shouldn't. Well, I shouldn't tell you what should or shouldn't seem strange to you, but the reason for this is that most of the pots that the big blind will win, or not most, but many of the pots that the big blind will win, he'll c-bet the flop and I'll fold, and he'll win a very small pot. When he c-bets and I call, that means that usually I have a pretty decent hand, and if he's c-betting a wide range, I'm actually, ahead of his range in those spots, and those are bigger pots. So what we learned here, a player with impetus and position is winning 56% of the pots in my database sample. And the pots won OOP without impetus are 25% larger. So overall, I'm profiting in these spots, which I should be if I'm deciding to make a preflop call. It is, it's important to note that not everybody's going to play the same range as I do preflop or play the same way I do postflop. So these numbers will vary, but I just wanted to take a look out of my own curiosity to see how these pots went. So you do lose more pots without impetus, but that's okay because the pots you win are bigger. So now we're going to look at a situation, a multi-street bluff, where we're deciding whether to fire some barrels. So it's a PLO situation. We're 200 big blinds deep. Joe is rather, and he raises $20 with a pretty weak hand, gets 3-bet to 60, and he calls. Relatively standard so far, I would say. On a flop of deuce 7 rainbow, the big blind checks. Joe decides to pot, and the big blind calls. And now the turn is a 10 of spades. We obviously don't pick up any equity, but the big blind checks. And Joe's wondering if he can barrel. And Joe knows some things about his opponent too. He knows that the big blind has aces or kings when he takes this line 100% of the time. He also knows that his opponent won't fold the turn, but to a 3-barrel, pot, his opponent's going to fold the river 60% of the time. And obviously if Joe checks turn, well, not obviously, but if Joe checks turn, the big blind's not going to fold the river. So if Joe wants to win this pot, it's going to have to be a 3-barrel. So since he's going to win 60% of the time on the river, you would say that he should bet to set up the profitable river bluff, right? I'm sure you guys can see where this is going. So we have the assumptions. The river's not going to be an ace or a king, which would give the big blind a boat. We're only allowing Joe to pot for simplicity. Math still works with different inputs, and we'll get into that in our next example. But this is easier. The big blind's going to call 100% of turns, and he's going to fold 60% of rivers. So this leads me to the 50% myth. As we all know, any single street pot-sized bluff that gets over 50% folds is immediately profitable. At 50%, it's break even, and this is, of course, compared to mucking your hand. So a lot of people think that, therefore, any multi-street action where each player is putting in an equal amount of money that leads to over 50% folds on a given final street is immediately profitable, also compared to mucking your hand. So, as you can guess, perhaps the first is true, the second is false, and it's a mistake that a number of people make. So an example, like the one we're talking about here, bet the turn to barrel river when it'll fold over half the rivers, and some things that people will say, build a pot that you'll win over half the time, as we talked about. Bet the turn to set up a profitable river bluff, and another situation is, of course, as we already went over, raise preflop to set up a profitable c-bet. So if we do the math here, the EV of checking down, I'm going to run through this just because it's important to know how to do a simple EV calc, if any of you out there don't know, but I'll go pretty quickly. If we check down our 0% equity in a $360 pot, we have $0 in EV, same as mucking our hands. To find the EV of barreling, we're assuming that the big blind is calling the turn always. So we're going to have to look at the EV when he folds the river, which is what we win when he folds, times the probability that he folds. And then we're going to add to it, or subtract. We're going to add a negative number of our EV when the big blind calls, which is going to be negative, as I said, times the probability the big blind calls. So when the big blind folds, we win the 360 that was in the pot on the turn, plus the 360 that the big blind put in when he called our turn bet. We get back our $360 turn bet, but that doesn't count towards profit because we are not winning that. That was part of the investment. So we're going to win 720 when the big blind folds. And you can see the problem here. When the big blind calls, we're going to lose our $360 turn bet as well as a $1,080 river bet. And so we're going to lose twice as much when called on the river than we won when our opponent folded. So if you would bet the turn to set up a profitable river bluff, you just made a 14.5 0.4 big blind mistake in just one hand. And I'm sure you guys can see where the issue is. People, when you each put in 360 on the turn, yes, you're going to win the pot over half the time given these assumptions, but in order to do that, it's going to cost you a bet of 1080, which when you are called means that the pot's going to be much bigger when you lose. So let's see if it works with floats as well. It's a different kind of multi-street bluff, but it gives us a better risk-reward scenario, because before we put in a big river bet, we're going to find out whether or not our opponent likes his hand. So for simplicity, we're going to make it a zero equity float, just like the previous example. Having some equity changes things, but this makes the calculations a lot simpler, and these examples are just to illustrate some points. So we have a 6 max no limit hand. Mark opens in the hijack with 8-7 of hearts. 300, only the small blind calls. So we have 700 in the pot on the flop. It goes check, check. Mark decides to go for a delay c-bet. It's a flop that I would usually bet, but it depends on the small blind and his range. Turn is an offsuit 3, and the small blind bets 500 into the $700 pot, and Mark is wondering if he should float. So he figures that by floating, he really credibly reps ace-x, or perhaps 9x through kings, and that if the small blind doesn't have anything on the river, he's very likely to check fold rather than try to bluff, and even check fold with some weak made hands that he might be betting for protection. Mark says if we each put in $500 on the turn, you guys know where this is going by now, and I win most of the pots on the river, I'm definitely going to profit. He also says I can get away with betting only 2/3 pot on the river, so if he folds half the time, I'm making a lot of money. He'll bet his good hands for us. We don't have to put another bet in, so it's a great risk-reward scenario. I always hear people talking about floating being a really good risk-reward scenario because you get information before you put more money in. And I've said it myself, and it is true when comparing a float to a bluff raise on the turn. However, characterizing it as a great risk-reward scenario is mischaracterizing it. So there are a few possible scenarios. If he bets the river, we're going to fold. We're not going to try to bluff raise. We'll just muck our hand. He's telling us, he has a fairly strong range, and that's kind of part of our getting away cheaply. If he checks, we're going to bet 1,200 into 1,700, and we'll see how much we need to win to make this profitable. Either he folds or he calls. If he raises, it's the same as him calling because we lose either way, and we're not going to put another chip in the pot. So if he bets river, we fold and we lost our $500 turn bet, or turn call rather. If he checks river and we bet and he folds, we're actually going to make his $500 turn bet plus the $700 that was already in the pot. So it is looking a little bit nice. But when we get to the third scenario, we are now losing $1,700, both our turn call and our river bet, when he does check call us. So to look at a couple of indifference points, we're going to need to do a little bit of algebra. So I'll just breeze through this as quickly as I can. It's very similar to the last situation, but now we have two variables. And we could take more time with this in the comments section of the thread of this video if you'd like. But we're going to let x equal the probability he bets the river. Let y equal the probability that he folds to your bet. And so now we're going to have, we lose our turn call x% of the time. 1 minus x% of the time, he is going to check to us, and then y% of the time, we're going to win the turn pot, which is 700, plus the turn bet, which is 500, and then 1 minus y% of the time, we're going to lose our turn call plus our river bet, which we have here, and it works out to this. The bets and calls were 500, 1,200, and 1,700. But we just divided by 100 as we're just looking for the ratio. And it would not make a difference. You do a bunch of algebra and you get to this equation on the bottom. And you can plug that into any number of calculators that will graph something for you. And this is what you get. So we're looking at a graph of our indifference points, break-even points for this float to be profitable. So some key points to look at. If he bets the river 75% of the time, we're not going to be able to make money. Even if he check folds 110% of the time, we'll barely be losing, and that's impossible. I think what's most interesting is that if he checks always, and we bet remember we're betting around 2/3 pot. He still needs to fold 59% of the time or more to make us profit at all. And if it's a much larger number than that, then we're actually going to be making a pretty good profit. But if it's a little bit more than that, we're not really making that much, obviously. And if you can look down the list, you can pause at this point if you want to read more about the various ratios. We could also figure out. We can make a formula that you can plug in your own variables and mess around with it later. It would not be too difficult. So the reason that this happens, the reason that people, I think, overestimate the various plays with initiative, multi-street bluffs, etc., is that everyone has EV. So once the blinds are posted, we're taught that poker is a zero-sum game, but the way that we calculate EV, once the blinds are posted, there's dead money in the pot, and the average EV for each player is positive, assuming they're playing perfectly. Or I should say the net EV is positive for all players. Because if the big blind folds, he loses 0, because we've already assumed that his big blind is gone. So bluffing and semi-bluffing, these are the most common EV calculations that people do. They're pretty easy to run, and it's kind of fun to be the one bluffing. And for some reason, these are all the calcs that people do, more or less. And I guess they're pretty simple to do. So they often come out to be very plus EV. So what that leads people to think is, it's so profitable to be the one betting. I'm making so much money with my pre-flop raise and flop steals versus this guy. He has no chance. These are things that I've heard people say. You have to keep in mind that calling flops with good hands against c-bets is very, very plus EV. And if you're comparing a play to folding and you're making a good play, you're never going to get worse than 0 EV if you're doing things right. So if you do calling EV calcs and you find that you have a hand you should fold, well, that's 0 EV. And if you have a hand that you should call, well, maybe that's plus 3 big blinds in EV, plus 10 big blinds in EV. So the fact that you can make a barely profitable c-bet compared to mucking your hand, or a very profitable barrel compared to mucking your hand, is not really anything to be very impressed about. And like I said, the caller can have very high EV situations. Just for some reason, we don't analyze them nearly as often. So we'll be wrapping this up for today. What I hope that I got across, because it's all I talked about, is that people overestimate the EV of multi-street bluff plays due to misunderstanding the true risk-reward structure of them. What people are, when they make this mistake, the mistake they're making is thinking that making a play that gets you to a plus EV bluff spot, so getting to that plus EV river bluff, if it costs you something to get there, then it's not necessarily plus EV. You have to factor in the cost. To just have a new number to think of rather than 50%, if you're going to pot twice with no fold equity on the first street, you're going to need to get them to fold 2/3 of the time on the later street. If you guys want to do some homework, you can think of some more examples. Here I listed one. So how can we better analyze all these spots to make better in-game judgments? Because it's going against our nature for a number of reasons that I already talked about. So I've been trying to think of what we can do, and that is going to be the topic for episode 2, part 2. That will be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. While I realized that for some of you this might have been review, I think there are several people who do make the mistakes that I discussed here, and for those of you who that applies to, hopefully this was very educational and helpful. Please leave any questions or comments, the usual, and I will see you guys soon with another video, and eventually with episode 2, part 2, which I'm pretty excited about. This is Phil Galfond for RunItOnce.com. Take care, guys.